Thank you, Kieran. Let us pray. Father God, we will be digging into your word now. Pray that we will not only understand, but find something that we need to apply to our own lives to make that change that is required so that we can serve you better. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Now, we start a brand new quarter this quarter, Rest for the Restless. And today, we're starting off the quarter's studies with the theme, Living in a 24/7 Society. Each week we have a verse to memorize, and this week it comes from Psalm chapter 84 and verse 2, which says, "My soul longs, yes, even faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh cry out to the living God." Sister Eleanor, please introduce our lesson in the context of the memory verse.
As Peter has said, this week's lesson talks about living in a 24/7 society and looks at the benefits of having rest and the consequences of not having quality rest in all aspects of our being. We're told that if we're not at rest, then we're restless, and that restlessness can lead to a feeling of being overwhelmed, a feeling of fear, of not being in control, anxiety, stress, etc. Our lesson reminds us that both physical and spiritual rest are essential for good physical and spiritual health. And the more our souls long, yes, even faints for the courts of the Lord, the stronger our love relationship with him becomes. And we can say like David, "My heart and my flesh cry out for the living God." It is all about an immersive love relationship with the one who gives perfect rest.
Okay, excellent summary already. Now, the quarter's lesson is normally written by one or more people. And this quarter, we have a couple who have written the lessons for us. Gerald and Chantal Klingbeil. And they come from Andrews University, and one of them belongs to the Ellen G. White estate. That's who they work for. Now, prior to researching the lesson, the couple, I managed to listen to a talk by them, and they said that they thought, when they were given the topic of rest in Christ, they thought, that's only going to be 2 lessons. That's going to be about the Sabbath, and that's not going to be much. But when they delved into the research, they realized there's so much involved. So over the next 13 weeks, we're going to see what they found out. And I had a quick glance at what the lesson themes were, and I could only see one related directly to the Sabbath. But we know that the Sabbath will be coming in at various other times as well. Now, because it's about living in a 24/7 society, we think of things being speedy, and so I'm going to speed off with a first question for the viewers and the congregation straight away. And the question is, what does it mean to live in a 24/7 society? What does it mean to live in a 24/7 society? And whilst you're thinking about that, I'd like to thank our moderators on YouTube and live stream, Sister Jennifer Mann and Gwyneth Johnson. We give them thanks for seeing that things are going well as we move on. So whilst waiting for the responses online, we're going to go straight to our first panelist, Elder Nicole, with a question. In the beginning, the world had just been created, and there was no sin. Why would God include a day of rest when he doesn't even get tired? Could you read Genesis 2, verses 1 to 3 and explain for us, please?
Yes, I will. Thank you so much. I'm reading from the New International Version, and this is Genesis 2, verse 1 to 3. And it says, "Thus the heaven and the earth were completed in all their vast arrays. But the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had made. So if we could look at this in three ways about rest. Firstly, we see the physical, right? God rested on the seventh day. Now we know that God did not require rest on the seventh day because he was exhausted. He rested to demonstrate the completion of his creative work, to provide a platform for us as human beings in terms of the organization, that 7 days of work, and to demonstrate the blessing of rest to us on that seventh day. That 7 day week is embedded in our DNA. And though some have tried to attempt to change that 7 day week throughout history, we know that during the French Revolution, they tried a 10-day week. It did not succeed. It failed because God is on a 7-day cycle. We too are on a 7-day cycle as well. We physically need the rest after 6 days of work. And that leads us on to that second type of rest, which is the emotional rest. See, God designed us, as Sister Eleanor said earlier, to rest regularly. Yes, rest is foreign to our lifestyle. You spoke about the 24/7 lifestyle, but our emotional and mental health will take a beating, and we may experience conditions that emerge as a result. And what happens is it starts to distract us from our purpose. When we do not rest, there are many consequences, and our purpose, which God has in store for us, may start to be curtailed. And thirdly, the spiritual rest. I read a commentary that said, God, having completed his work on creation, rests, as if to say, this is the destiny of those who are my people, to rest as I rest, to rest in me. So this is about spending quality time with our Creator, to build a relationship, remembering and being in awe of what he has created, and to grow spiritually.
Thank you very much, Elder Nicole. Very whole answer to develop whole people. I heard the words DNA come out in your speech, and I know someone who's well into his DNA. And I'm going to ask Elder David, can you share any other texts that teach us about the necessity of rest?
Well, there are a couple of texts that come to mind. Psalm 4, verses 8 reads, I will both lay me down in peace and sleep, for thou, Lord, only makest me dwell in safety. And then we can contrast that with Exodus 23, verse 12, where it says, 6 days shalt thou do thy work, and on the seventh day thou shalt rest, that thine ox and thine ass may rest, and thy son and thy handmaiden and the stranger may also be refreshed. I just also want to draw attention to two other texts in Psalm 139, verse 14. It says, I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. And John 1, verse 3, speaking of Jesus, basically says that all things were made by him, and without him, nothing that has been made was made. And that includes our human life. And as we know, that our human bodies are very complex, biological, neurological, respiratory, cardiovascular, musculoskeletal, hormonal, automated immune system. It's an incredibly complex, you could say, mechanism. And based upon what we know now, then what David says about praising God because we're fearfully and wonderfully made brings everything together as to the marvels of God. And Jesus here also, we have to understand, is the one that put all of this together. You know, as you said, the complexity of our DNA and RNA, which we've heard a lot about in the news recently, the code of life, which is passed down from generation to generation. And this is all comes together and is based upon a cycle. You know, we have, for example, a heartbeat. It beats and rests. It beats and rests in a particular rhythm. And so that rhythm goes through life based upon, frequencies, peaks, troughs, and the proper use of and conservation of our energy. You would have heard of the circadian cycle, which is basically a mechanism whereby your metabolism sort of comes to a halt or slows down as soon as it gets dark, in line with our planet, and it's turning, and the moon and everything else, and it's going around the sun. Everything closes down, and there are changes within our metabolism that bring about a state of rest. Again, as we know, as we sleep, there are certain hormones like melatonin that release that are released into our system that help our immune system, that actually help to prevent cancer. So if you don't get a good night's sleep, you are more prone to have certain diseases. So when we see that Psalm 4 verse 8 is speaking of the fact that when he is in God, when God has set you aside because of righteousness, you are in fact in a good place. You can rest. You don't have to worry about the issues of this life. And I personally know that when I have committed myself to spending a few minutes in prayer before I go to bed, I have the best rest ever. If I am so tired that I just fall asleep, I just wake up in the middle of the night, I'm thinking about the things for the next day, and it's such an agitating experience. And so it is with the Sabbath rest, and I just really want to point this out very quickly, is that the command in the Sabbath rest in Exodus 23 verse 12 is split up into two parts. It basically there's a command that thou shalt rest, thou shalt work for 6 days. That is a command. You need to work for 6 days. You need to be engaged in or partake in productive activity that brings prosperity. And then resting in God allows you to experience true peace, because you see the results of your work, etc., etc. So it's so complex, but true rest is found in God or Jesus Christ alone.
Super. Thank you very much, Elder David.
Mr. Smith, do we have any responses from our congregation or from our radio listeners or online listeners?
I can see David there trying to take a bit of a rest. But let's here's some points that some people we questioned that Pete talked about. Elizabeth says being in a 24/7 society means always being on top, never losing a moment, always losing one's breath, trying to fulfill life's demand. Elder Mombi said it's a rat race, or it's consumerism society where people become very selfish and seductive, and so people are always trying to achieve and always trying to get stuff. Karen said it's a hustling and bustling society. No time to recharge our batteries. And then over on YouTube, Lillian said, always busy, always on the go. Irma gave a testimony, and we just want to pray for Irma. She says she actually collapsed at work this week. So, Irma, we're going to be lifting up in prayer that God will give you the strength so that you will take a bit of rest. Erlene says, a society that is fully burnt out, 24/7 society. Foxtrot says, society is an increasing demand for us to work, which has a negative influence on our health. And she says, thank God for rest. He gave us so that we would not be burnt out. And I'm thinking about all the responses that we have given. Then I thought about COVID and what people have said during COVID. Society has become more productive because we're at home. We're not moving anymore. So it's a society where we're always going, always moving. No time for rest, no time to stop, because we always want to achieve much more than we already have. And here's a point. Karen says, reply to email days and nights without much boundaries. We are connected to friends, families through various social networking platforms similarly. This is wearing us out. I'm going to read two more comments. Akusa says, we are constantly on the go, on our devices, rising early and staying up late, but this is all in vain. God gives us rest, and is the one that blesses our effort. I'm going to send our listeners and our viewers onto our website, onto YouTube. There's a beautiful piece that was done by Jennifer Mann, when she talks about the power of social media and how it affects our ability to rest, and the impact, Elder Pete, Sister Eleanor, on our emotional and mental health. But the key word that is coming through, keywords, always on the go and very busy. Over to you, Elder Pete and Sister Eleanor.
Thank you, Pastor. As we can see, there are a lot of opinions on what it means to live in this 24/7 society. And Irma, thank you for your testimony. We will remember you in prayer and showing an example of what happens when we just keep going. Now, hot on the heels of that previous question that we asked to the viewers and congregation, if you do have any responses, then please do come up to the mics and speak, or indeed if you have any questions as well. Thank you. So hot on the heels of that, we have another question. We need to encourage people so that they can appreciate what God is saying about us resting through our own experiences, just as we've heard. So question number 2 for the congregation and listeners are, what are some practical examples that you can share of how you find rest on the Sabbath? Remember, you're helping somebody else by sharing this with them. So, what are some of the practical illustrations or examples that you can share about how you find rest on the Sabbath? So we've heard a little about, as Christians, we have this cycle of rest and the Sabbath and so on. We've those instructions that actually protect us from overloading ourselves. But what about the secular world, where the Bible is not used as a guide? Does that mean they suffer totally? Sister Eleanor, I'm going to present that one to you.
Well, Elder Peter, even in the world recognizes that our busy 24/7 lifestyle can lead to us running on empty. Today, large numbers of people pay good money, and a lot of money in some cases, to various organizations such as mindfulness in an attempt to find rest and become more peaceful and less anxious. And as Christians, we've already recognized that we are not exempt from feeling overwhelmed, as one character in the book of Jeremiah found out. Elder David, do introduce us to this character found in Jeremiah 45, 1-3. How would you describe the emotional health and explain why he was feeling this way?
I'll just read that for you from the King James Version, Jeremiah 45, 1-3. The word that Jeremiah, the prophet, spake unto Baruch, the son of Neriah, when he had written these words in a book at the mouth of Jeremiah, in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, saying, Thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, unto thee, O Baruch, thou didst say, Woe is me now, for the Lord hath added grief to my sorrow. I fainted, and my sighing, and I find no rest. Now, just to put this into context, I remember a situation whereby I was given a message to give to somebody, and when I read the message, that message caused me great concern. I knew that the person who was going to receive this message would not respond positively. And as I read this message, I felt anxious, I felt fearful, I felt agitated and concerned. And as the messenger, I sort of turned back and said, look, do you really want to send this message? And you know the term that we are acquainted with that says, don't kill the messenger, you know, when you're someone who's bringing bad news. And so this was the backdrop here. Baruch wasn't a prophet himself, but he was someone who saw everything that Jeremiah was writing down, and he intended to send to the kings. We know that there was a great strife at the time. We know that the people had rebelled against God. They'd gone to Egypt for help instead of God. God said that he was going to send Nebuchadnezzar to destroy Egypt and break them down and eventually come for them. This was filled, you know, he already had sorrow. Now this was, this just made him feel, and you can think of all the words, you know, scared, anxious, nervous. He was suffering emotionally, suffering physically, suffering probably from insomnia, lack of sleep. His mind could not rest. That was the state, and that was the reason for him feeling the way he did.
Okay, thank you for the introduction to that. Very little known about character, Baruch. And how he was finding no rest. Now, this is a very short chapter, only 5 verses. So, Elder Nicole, could you continue reading Jeremiah 45 and verses 4 and 5 to find out how Baruch did eventually find emotional and physical health, and what lesson we can learn from that?
Absolutely. I'm continuing to read from the New International Version, verses 4 and 5. And it says, "But the Lord has told me to say to you, this is what the Lord said. I will overthrow what I have built and uproot what I have planted throughout the earth. Should you then seek great things for yourself? Do not seek them, for I will bring disaster on all people, declare the Lord. But wherever you go, I will let you escape with your life." See, in this passage, Baruch is reminded of the power and the authority of God to do as he please. And it also puts some of Baruch's perceived problems in perspective. Some of Baruch's disappointment and tiredness may have sprung from his desires for big things for himself, like we all do. He expected to be in a better, more positive place in his life than he was at the moment. And the disappointment of wanting great things but not being able to get them weighed heavily on him. But God wanted Baruch to have an appropriate perspective, one that was not focused with his own advancement and perceived success. Because in the passage says, "But I will give your life to you as a prize in all places wherever you go." That is God's reassurance to Baruch. And it was a strong reassurance. He would take care of him. And it's those words that Baruch finally found that emotional and physical health. He treasured the promise that God gave to him. And again, that phrase, "wherever you go," reassures Baruch that he can rest confidently that this promise is for the rest of his life. You see, Baruch was used to writing out what God spoke to Jeremiah for others, not for himself. But God had a word for his discouraged, exhausted state. And what we have to recognize in our own discouragement, in our own discouraging time, is that this word of encouragement is also for us.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So the focus from yourself and your problems onto Christ and what he can do for you. Very, very key point. And we have a member of the congregation who has something to say. I'll hand you over.
Good morning. It's just a question. I think it was sort of slightly answered by the sister that just spoke. In Jeremiah 45, verse 5, God said Baruch's life would be a prey wherever he went. If I look at the word prey, it means like something or someone that's being hunted. Does that mean that Baruch had done something wrong and was being punished for it?
Thank you for that question. I can attempt to answer it, or I can pass it on to one of our panelists or senior pastor. I don't know if you want to take that one, or I can attempt to answer it.
That's a very good question. I think Baruch is here you think about what was happening where Israel as a whole was under attack and where they were living. So God was using Baruch as a kind of a metaphor for the challenges that Israel was undergoing. God was using Baruch as a kind of example, because if you continue on to the text, the Bible says in I think verse 5, where God says, "Listen, you're going to be okay." Did he not say that?
Yes.
He said, "You're going to be all right." But he was using Baruch to say to Israel, "Listen, this is how you're living. This is what's going to happen to you." But then he goes on to say, "Baruch, don't worry, you will be okay."
Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. We have those promises as well from God that we will be okay. In Hebrews 13, verse 5, it says, "I will never leave you or forsake you." In Romans 8:28, he says, "All things work together for good." So when we're feeling overwhelmed, just remember and hold on to God's promises. Pastor, do we have any responses to that second question? Is it possible, which was practical examples of rest?
Yes, I'm looking on our live stream, sorry, on our YouTube chat. Rochelle says what she does, she finds podcasts on Bible topics, and she rests. Tom says, I discovered true Sabbath rest during the COVID pandemic as it meant spending more time resting and not having to rush from programs to programs and to meetings. Bibi talks about sleeping. Sometimes I have a walk in the park just to sit there and have a peaceful rest. Paul says it's not just a resting of the regular resting from work, physical rest, but also a chance to rest the mind, which I find to be very therapeutic. As Ray says, over the pandemic period, I have discovered two improvements: not rushing to church and participating in a packed day of programming, always spending at least 1.5 hours on Sabbath walks in nature. That seems to be coming through both on YouTube and online. I mean, Karen talks about taking nice walks. JG says, she goes hiking just to hear the chirping of the birds. Akusa says, I love going for Sabbath walks in my local park and reading the word in my chill den. I wonder, Pete, if we have a chill den. A room full of plants.
Wow.
Elizabeth says, in this gadget-filled world where one is constantly bombarded with notification from 100-meter channel, I simply decide to ignore that and concentrate on God. I wish I could turn my mobile phone off on a Sabbath. Alana says, I take pleasure in seeking out the poor and needy on Sabbath. In other words, she spends the Sabbath just helping people. Foxtrot over there in Barbados, and we're praying for the people in Barbados because of Hurricane Elsa. Yeah. She says she spends time reading the spirit of prophecy. Gift of life. We need to understand that we're lambs to the slaughter daily. However, God will never leave us nor forsake us. I think that was in reference to the Baruch question that Sister Wainwright raised the point. Elder Mwambe says, life can and will spring up great disappointment and frustration. All is not in this life as we know. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. Again, in reference to the point that Sister Wainwright raised. Helena James says, she goes to Ecological Park in what I called my favorite place in the woods. She said it's very peaceful with birds songs, whistling leaves. She's very poetic here. Nature and renewal for a walk. So here we're seeing people are saying, going for a walk. People are saying helping others. Some people are saying have a fast from gadgets. Some people are reading. Paul is just chilling and lazing out. Some people are saying, well, I'll take a sleep.
Super. Thank you very much for your responses. Please keep them coming in. And I would also advise you to get a pen and paper and write some of those ideas down. I've already written one down myself, and that's the chill den. I'll have to find a location to make this chill den. Now, an opposite of being rested or resting is being occupied and being busy. We have so many labor-saving devices these days, yet we have so little time. From telephone boxes where you used to have to go out of your house to make a phone call, we got advanced, as they say, and we had house phones, so we didn't have to go out, but now we have mobile phones, and then we have smartphones, and we've gone from telegrams to letters, which are now referred to as snail mail, and to email. Everything is just instant, and people are expected to always be available, and thus constantly busy. So I have another question for you, viewers, listeners, and congregation. Is it possible for someone to be too busy if they are doing good things for God? Is it possible for someone to be too busy if they are doing good things for God? Okay, so as you're thinking of your answers and putting them down, I'm going on to a different theme now, because You may have heard that in the Greek language there are 7 different words for love, whereas in English language we only have one word, love. Now, the word rest is similar. I heard this week that there are over 30-odd different words in the Hebrew language for the one word that we use for rest or rested. And we're going to examine some of those words now, not all 30, but we're going to look at a few of those.
Elder David, could you share with us a couple of examples that are associated with this word rest and also the associated scriptures?
Yeah. Of course. As Elder Burton Peter said, that there are over 34 different words to describe different types of rest. The one that we're all familiar with, coming from Genesis 2, verse 3, which I believe Elder Nicole covered earlier, is the Shabbat, which we understand to be that rest which God instituted at creation, and He blessed it, and it's a holy time, a time that He sets aside for intimate relationship with us. So I think we're preaching to the converted in terms of the meaning of that, although we know that there is far more to explore on the subject of the Shabbat in that context. Then we look at Exodus 5, verse 5, and we see this is the word rest used by Pharaoh. Exodus 5, verse 5, reading from the King James Version, and it says, "And Pharaoh said, Behold, the people of the land now are many, and ye make them rest from their burdens." Now, this is a question that Pharaoh put to Moses. In other words, there was no such thing as a time of rest, for physical rest. What Pharaoh was saying, that the tradition is that they work 24/7, and you want to make them rest, referring to the actual physical rest that is there. But as you know, that the question was put to Pharaoh, that God wanted the people to come out so that He could rest in the desert with His people. So Pharaoh didn't understand that concept, and in fact he was actually being quite defiant in saying that he would not, because if you read on, he says, I'm not going to let them rest. I'm going to actually make their burdens even more, so they get, if they had any little rest, it would be gone. So he was basically saying that this concept of rest, which God obviously introduced, and because He is the creator, He therefore does not respect God in any way whatsoever, and He's going to remove any concept of rest from His people. We then go on to Deuteronomy 5, verse 14, where it basically, again, is the sort of upgraded version of the 10 Commandments, where it then says, but 7 days, that the Lord, that you would work for 6 days, but on the 7th day, then you will find rest. And then it goes on to tell the children of Israel that, you're going to find this rest because you're coming from a land that didn't give you any rest. So this was actually looking to God as a means of their rest and their support. And of course, finally, we look at Job in his desperate situation in Job 3, verse 13, where he's looking for this rest. He just, it's preceded by him wishing that he was never born, wishing that whoever provided milk in his mother's breast didn't do so, that he had stayed in the grave. He just wanted to rest from all of the pain and suffering that he was going through. But the main thing here, that rest, throughout all its connotations, relies on what Jesus Christ can give us, what Jesus Christ has provided for us. And in the context of the fact that we have come to a point where we realize that without Christ there is just death, suffering, and pain, when we understand the true meaning of rest, that allows us to praise our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ for providing that rest in Him.
Okay, thank you. So we've just looked at 2 words there, and we see how much there is in the rest element in just those 2 words. Are there any more that you can add, Elder Nicole?
Absolutely. I've got one here called shokat. That's a type of rest, and that is in Joshua 11, verse 23. And again, I have the New International Version. And it says, so Joshua took the entire land, just as the Lord had directed Moses, and he gave it as an inheritance to Israel according to the tribal divisions. Then the land had rest from war. So this Hebrew word here for rest means to be quiet, because the key battles, they had ended, and the enemy's resistance, they had been overcame. And so the land was now settled and rest. It was having a time of peace. There's another type of rest called raga, and that is in Deuteronomy 28, verse 65, and in the chapter 50 of Jeremiah. I'm not going to read those two verses. However, this word here for rest in both these passages, it comes after a time of war and strife. And here now is a time of rest. This rest here now is to be still. Be still, do not move. This is a great imagery, because when we lie down to rest, to be still, to not move from the shadow of the Almighty, we are totally protected and blessed as long as we stay there. So these rest here in these passages, they come after a time of trouble, and it shows that the true rest is in God.
Amen.
Thank you. So from those explanations, we learn that rest affects us physically, socially, emotionally, as well as spiritually, and that it's not limited to Sabbath alone. Peter, when you introduced that element to our study, you said there were several words that can express rest. So can you add any other key word to at all?
Okay, I suppose I've got maybe 20-something more to choose from. So the one I'm going to select is shakab. There's one at shakab, and we've just heard from Elder Nicole about lying down and rest, and this is where we see the nuances in the Hebrew language, because shakab also means to lie down, and this time it means to lie down and sleep. Now, when we think of those two words, we might think, oh yeah, I'm going to my bed to sleep, but in this context, it actually means death. Because in Deuteronomy 31, verse 16, we see where the Lord said to Moses, behold, you will rest with your fathers. That's the New King James Version. But in the New International Version, it says you are going to rest with your ancestors. So again, we see that word shakab used in 2 Samuel 7, verse 12, New International Version this time. It says, when your days are over, death, and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise you up, etc. But when we go into the New Testament here, John 11, verse 11, New King James Version again, we see that the word rest was used in the context of when Lazarus died. It says, these things he said, and after that he said to them, our friend Lazarus sleeps. That's the New King James Version, but in the Aramaic Bible, in plain English, I loved this version because it said, these things Yeshua said, and afterwards he said to them, Lazar, our friend, is resting. I am going that I may awaken him. So as you can see there, I've actually jumped over into the New Testament example already, but that segues nicely into the New Testament examples, but we won't be looking at too many examples here. I'm going to actually choose the word anapao. That is one of the Greek words that we find in the New Testament. And Elder Nicole, that word anapao defines rest in one of the most popular New Testament Bible verses that talk about rest. Could you read Matthew 11, verses 28 and 29, please, and explain the context of rest there?
Absolutely. And this is the passage. It says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take your yoke upon me and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your soul. Here, it is such a beautiful and thoughtful message to those who are burdened. Those were the ones whom Jesus were addressing with this call. He was saying, instead of living in self-sufficiency, and we've spoken before about those examples and illustrations, the things we do to take up our time, instead of living in self-sufficiency, he called anyone who was compelled to come to him for help. He's saying, come and cease from movement and labor so that you can recover and gain strength. And I believe it shows two things here. One, that God wants us to completely rely on him. And number two, he is showing us where and in whom our strength really lies.
Okay, thank you for that response. And we also have another addition from our congregation. Elder Valsi.
I'm being a rebel here. We have spoken positively about rest, how important it is to rest. Can we have too much rest?
Now, that's an interesting question. Can we have too much rest? I'm hearing a resounding yes from the congregation. Now, in that text we heard about from Matthew 11, we heard, come unto me, all you labor, heavy laden, I will give you rest. He speaks about my yoke is easy, my burden is light. When we think of a yoke, well, sometimes it's carried by one animal, but sometimes, mainly it's two. And the two working side by side enables a job to be done to satisfaction and makes the burden lighter. When we think of ourselves and that wooden yoke and Christ at the other side, he's the one that gives us the strength there, but he also says, come aside and rest. So if we are resting when Christ is doing all of the work, then we think of the yoke going like this, one person working, the other person just resting or doing nothing, then all you're going to do is get that thing that's being plowed going around in circles, because one would be moving, the other wouldn't. So too much rest isn't good. Too much, I think in Proverbs it says, too much rest, too much slumber, and people will come and take what you've got, or something like that. Please look that up. So I think in answer to your question, one can have too much rest. I don't know if anyone had any additions to that.
I think oneness makes the point. Too much rest can lead to laziness.
Aye.
And Gift of Life says too much rest equals laziness. So some people are over-rested, and some people are under-rested. I don't know if there are such words, but so if the over-rest can lend some of that rest to the under-rest, then the over-rest and the under-rest becomes totally and properly rested. But the point is very clear that some people actually rest too much.
Okay. I'm going to actually choose one of those words that you've used, under-rested, to move into a next example, because in Mark 6, verses 30 and 31, we see a possible example of this. I'd like you, Elder David, please, to read Mark 6, verses 30 and 31 and explain how that text expresses what Jesus knew and what we actually need to know.
Okay, yeah. Can I just make a quick comment on the previous point in terms of if you can rest too much? Just to bring out that point that we are commanded to work. It's in the same command. Work 6 days. So you have to, work 6 days. Because if you read the text in Deuteronomy, further on, it says when they weren't working or applied themselves in sort of productive labor, it gave them time to consider other gods and start worshiping other gods. So when you're not at work actively pursuing something productive, you're going to make time to worship Satan, quite literally. I just thought I'd get that one in there. But going to the text in question, Mark 6 verses 30 to 31, it reads, and the apostles gathered themselves together unto Jesus and told them all things, both that they had done and that they had taught. Now, looking at the context of this situation in Mark here, you don't see what the other Gospels tell you about what Jesus had told them to do. He had told them in Matthew 10 that he would give them power against unclean spirits, to heal the sick, to preach the gospel, everything else. So when they had completed that, or partially completed that, they came back and they were absolutely amazed that what Jesus had said, that they had been filled with the Holy Spirit. They'd seen the dead raised, and including Judas was one of those who was raising the dead and healing the sick, etc., etc. That's another discussion. But Jesus then says, look, okay, now don't get too excited. I try to sort of visualize in my own words, but he says, look, come, let us set aside a time where we can rest. He says, come ye yourselves apart into the desert place and rest a while. So at a desert place, a desolate place where you can really begin to bring the levels of adrenaline down, bring the levels of cortisone down, because as we know, based upon modern science, high levels of these stress hormones, which are there to help you fight and fight, and when you get excited, if they're in your bloodstream you're emotionally excited, and you haven't given yourself time to rest, and they can do damage. So Jesus is basically, as the creator, as I said, the one that made everything, without him nothing was made, actually knows our systems, and he's calling them aside to take the time to actually calm down. I'm sure Pastor will understand the experience of being filled with your spirit. Sometimes when you're preaching with power and strength, it takes a tremendous toll upon the physical body. Again, the health message comes in here, because you need a good physical body to actually be someone with the Holy Spirit and to preach the message with power.
Thank you. Pastor, are there any comments to the question that was posed? Can someone be too busy if they are doing good things for God?
Well, Alana says no. That one captured my attention. Devil finds time for idle hands. So she disagrees. But Elaine says Martha is a good example of somebody who was actually too busy, that Jesus says, take time, reflect. JG says, yes, we still need rest. Doing lots of stuff for God might also means no time to spend time with him. True rest happens when we spend time with God. Elaine then steps on my personal corn. She and others also on YouTube says ministers are sometimes too busy. Maybe she's married to a pastor, or maybe she's related to a pastor, and their works get them away from their families, so it impacts on their health. So balance is required. Elizabeth, please pray for me. Elder Mohammed said, it is possible to be too busy. And what he's saying, that doing good things does not necessarily make you peaceful. He's saying that we need personal time for reflection. Margaret makes the same point Margaret Mapp makes the same point on YouTube. She says we need renewal, we need rest, we need balance. Foxtrot says, from a health perspective, too much rest can increase the risk of diabetes, heart disease, strokes. We need to stay active over there from Barbados. Maura says we can have too much rest, doing things for God, and forget our first love. Whatever we do it with the perfect love of Jesus Christ. That never ends. And we probably need to pray for Lorna, because Lorna gave a testimony that she was resting too much because she was ill. And she just had to get up, and then her health was renewed. So there are people both on live stream and YouTube that are saying that, yes, we can be working too much, and we need the strength and we need the grace of God. Sabbath rest away from we says, most people are so busy they can't find time to rest. So the Sabbath is so important to spend time with God. Also in the week, we find time to be in God's presence without the Bible. And that part I don't understand, but I think what she's saying is that we need to spend time with God and spend time in his word. Katecha Francis, I hope I pronounced her name correctly, says, we are admonished to be temperate in all things. Now, I like what Margaret Mapp over there, I think she's either in Barbados or St. Vincent, she says we need a balanced life, enough rest and enough work.
Yeah. Thank you.
But I'm going to add enough rest, enough work, and enough time in the presence of God. I'm just going to add that, throw that in, because the physical is good, the emotional is good, but if we neglect the spiritual, Sister Eleanor, we will find ourselves in trouble. Can I read the last one? Karen B says, someone said to me, even doing nothing is doing something. I believe they meant that sometimes you have to just stop and do nothing.
Thank you, Pastor. Final question to our listeners and viewers. What do you think is the connection between God and rest?
Knowing God.
What do you think is the connection between God and rest?
Can I just jump in, because this is a point that came through that I think we skipped over. When Jesus' disciples came back, right? and they wanted to continue working, he says, no, stop. Come a while, let's go into the desert and let us take a rest. So even Jesus encouraged his disciples to take time out from the work that they were doing.
Thank you for that. And when, again, coming back to that question, we see, is it possible to be doing great things? And Pastor mentioned, as did Elder Nicole right at the beginning, that it's about that balance, the spiritual, physical, mental capacities that we have as human beings. And the Pharisees thought they were doing great things, but being busy doesn't necessarily mean busy being productive. And I always remember a phrase our parents used to use, too much of one thing is good for nothing. Okay, so let's come back to the creation. We started off with talking about the world being created. Despite having a perfect creation, including the introduction of rest for an even more balanced life, sin entered the world. And one of the first sins that was committed was by a person called Cain. Elder David, could you tell us who Cain was and how he is described in Genesis chapter 4 and the reason why he's described that way?
Okay, I've got the text here, Genesis 4, 1 to 12. I won't read all of that. I'll just basically paraphrase. I think many of our viewers and congregation know the story. However, it does start off by basically saying that Eve conceived and had Cain. So Cain was the firstborn. And I think that's put there for a particular reason, because inheritance goes on usually to the firstborn. We know that's not always the case, but that was the traditional view. It then goes on to say there was, in verse 3, that in the process of time came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord, and Abel also brought the firstlings of his flock, the fat and everything. So it mentions the fat, etc. That means that there would have been instructions, as we saw presented in the Mosaic law, as to how to present the offering. So this precedes the Mosaic system. So this, as we know, is pointing to the Savior. Now we know that Adam and Eve were promised that from their loins, from their seed, would come a Savior. So they had high hopes for Cain and Abel to step into that role, and may have conveyed that. I'm now speculating. May have conveyed that to them. So Cain presents what he feels that that being the oldest, he should give, and it's not accepted. Okay, but God comes down. I don't know if this was on the Sabbath day or not. I would like to think it would be, but that would be from the bias of being a Seventh-day Adventist. But he comes down and he basically says, and the Lord, in verse 6, and the Lord said unto Cain, why art thou wroth, and why is your countenance fallen? And it's interesting that God comes down and has a personal conversation with Cain in an attempt to save him. And basically says, if thou doest well, in verse 7, thou shalt be accepted, and if thou doest not well, sin lieth at thee. So God points out that sin is the issue. All right, so there's no real active expression of sin. God is trying to nip it in the bud here. And then, as we know, as a result of this conversation, because God says, you shall have power over it, said, you shall rule over him. In other words, God is saying that with my help, you can rule over sin. You don't have to go down this road. But Cain ignored that and then killed his brother. In a message to God, well, if you want to accept his offering over my offering, if I kill him, then you can only accept my offering because I'm the only one left. It was really a defiant way of putting it. That's how I see it. So there we see that Cain finds himself in this position of wondering because he did not understand or accept the rest that was what he could have had through offering the sacrifice, as God had pointed out, it pointing forward to when Jesus Christ would come and save him, although he would have been in the past.
Thank you. Sister Nicole, very quickly, what was the outcome for Cain, and what does that teach us about rest?
Thank you so much, Sister Eleanor. And we can find this in Genesis 4, verses 13 to 17. And because of time, I'm not going to read the passage. But what is quite interesting is that although, as Elder David mentioned, Cain was defiant, he was still distressed when God cursed him. He said, the punishment is more than I can bear. And again, although he was disobedient, and he was probably more concerned about the punishment than the sin itself, he clearly understood that it was not good to be outside of the presence of God. We cannot find rest when we run away from God. We try to satisfy our spiritual hunger with other things, with people, with our hectic 24/7 lifestyle. But although, Cain established a city and a large family, these aren't necessarily negative things. However, if we do not work for God, all our efforts will be in vain.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And so we see this restless wanderer still finding his hope in the Lord, who's the only one that can give peace. So I'm going to Pastor Royston now and going to ask, are there any final comments from our listeners or our viewers? And if anyone from the congregation wants to give a final comment, please feel free to come up and do so.
Time flies when you're spending time with good friends, Elder Peter and Sister Eleanor, David and Nicola, and our viewers. But here are some points that are coming through with regards to the question about the connection. Somebody says, we get to hear from God more. Elizabeth says we get to know God more. Elaine says spending time with God. Erlene says mirroring God, because God rested, even though he wasn't tired. So we are becoming like God. Karen says we can hear God. That's over on live stream. We can hear God's voice and direction more. Blessing says it's a sort of obedience to God. Alana says the first break of rest was introduced by God himself. But Sibel over there, and I'm sure she should be resting because she's in Australia. I'm going to read two comments. One from Sibel over there in Australia. And she says, we have a moment to listen and to hear God. Thank you for that, Sibel, even though you should be resting because it's very late over in Australia at this time. But that's a very powerful point that you're making. But then Wainwright, Juliet says, when we are physically tired, it affects our spiritual and mental state. God knows that we are, but only frail humans. And for us to be rejuvenated, we need to recharge our batteries to help us function more. So the connection is that God gives this to us so that we can regenerate, so that we can be revived and we can be revitalized. And the last point from live stream says, sin has made us to be restless nomads, but God is calling us to come home and give us a rest. I'm the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. So this sense coming across from live stream is that the connection is personal. It's personal. In other words, rest makes me more able to deal with myself, my life, my reality, my family, but also it also helps me to deal with God. So when we rest, we're showing that God is in charge of our lives. Now, somebody is thrown in, and I must throw this in, gift of life, and he references Hebrews chapter 4, 1-10, which gives clear instruction and understanding of rest. The Greek word there, Elder Pete and Sister Lauren, is the word sabbatismos, which is not talking about the Sabbath rest, but it is talking about the eternal rest. It's going to be rest from all our labors, all our burdens, because old things would have passed away and all things would have become new. So there'll be no more sickness, no more sin. So gift of life, that is talking about the eternal rest, the sabbatismos, when we enter into that final rest with God. And Sibel pointed out, Pastor, it's only 8 p.m. Over to you guys.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for your comments that have been coming in. Very strong points being raised there, giving a good introduction to our theme of rest that we'll be considering for the quarter. So we saw Cain rejecting a relationship with God, and with no God, he had no rest. But if we know God, we will know rest. So, panelists, we'd like to share a final thought for us to reflect on over the coming week. Elder Nicole, we'll go to you first, please.
Thank you. Yes, I saw a wonderful quote from a lady called Rachel Farrenbach when I was studying this lesson. And it says, I began to see Sabbath rest for what it truly is, a desire for my Creator to spend time with me for my good, and everything changed, end quote. See, our Creator wants nothing but the best for us. And because his thoughts are higher than ours, we should recognize that when he sets aside a specific time for us to rest, it is for our absolute benefit. He loves us with an everlasting love, and this is one of the ways that he expresses his love for us, to give us rest.
Lovely. What a wonderful gift. Thank you, Elder Nicole. And we'll move on to Elder David now, please.
The Sabbath rest for me, looking at the many parameters of rest that we've looked at this week, although it didn't just focus on the Sabbath rest, but I realized that it's not just a physical thing. It's an opportunity to enter into another dimension. Obviously we live in a dimensions of space and time, but this is a dimension that takes us right into the presence of God, into eternity. When viewed from that perspective, then your whole attitude towards Sabbath rest becomes very measured and more enjoyable. Also, other areas of rest. It's taught me to, before making any decision, before anything comes out of my mouth, to pause and rest. Consider what would be the outcome. Who's going to hear this message? How is it going to be perceived? And make a proper decision based upon taking the time to rest and properly consider the outcome. It's just like looking at a message that you might be writing in anger and looking at it carefully and then pressing the delete button instead of the send. We've all done that. So many different ways of looking at the concept of rest in Christ.
Thank you for giving us that element of rest as well, and also for your links with science and religion. They're definitely not opposing elements that don't meet, but we thank you very much for your points as well for rest. And we move on now to Sister Eleanor.
I'd like to share this quote with everyone. It's from Augustine of Hippo. He said, "Thou hast made us for thyself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in thee."
Very concise point there, and it's given us something to think about. I hope you've been writing these things down. As I said, when we do our studies, it's for you to consider and think, what does this mean to me? How does this have an impact on my life, and what do I ought to be doing? I'd like to thank the panelists. I'd like to thank the congregation. I'd like to thank Sister Eleanor and Pastor and our moderators, Jennifer and Gwyneth. And I'd like to thank you and thank God for rest. Now, we may have heard the term "no rest for the wicked," and the phrase is sometimes used as a Bible quote, but it's not actually in the Bible in that real way. It's a mix-up of Isaiah 57, verses 20 and 21, which says, "But the wicked are like the tossing sea, which cannot rest, whose waves cast up mire and mud. There is no peace, says my God, for the wicked." Peace, or true rest, can only be found in God. We heard that several times today. Isaiah 9, verse 6 tells us, "For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." Imagine that, Prince of Peace, the Prince of Rest. True rest is an attitude. We can only rest when we feel safe. God is related to relationships and not things. So God wants us to spend time with him, as rest for our restlessness can only come through him. I pray that as you study this quarter's lessons, you will be able to discover the Prince of Peace and be willing to share with others the true meaning of rest. Peace be with you as you study about restlessness and rebellion next week. Thank you.
What a morning we've had. We have really been blessed with the lesson discussion It was very interactive. And I'm sure that we are going to go home and change our lifestyle. If you were going to bed at 8 o'clock, make it 7. If you're going to bed at 9, make it 8. Don't make it 10 and 11. Thank you so much, Elder Peter and Sister Eleanor, for being in charge this morning of the lesson. And Pastor, we did miss you last week, so don't get jealous. You are truly, truly missed. We miss your smiling face and the way in which you usually handle the online. Thank you so much, congregation, for coming out this morning. And we hope that we'll see you again next Sabbath, God willing. Unfortunately, we've got to cancel the park. We were meant to go to the park this afternoon to discuss the Sabbath school lesson, but because of the weather, we've got to postpone it until next week, God willing. And this will be a weekly visit to the park where we can meet together and enjoy each other's company and discuss God's word. Please check go online and for the update to see what we are doing so that we'll know whether or not we'll be going to the park again next week, Sabbath, at 4 p.m. Let us pray. Gracious God, divine King, shield, strength, protector, and deliverer. Thank you, dear God, for your holy words. Thank you, dear Father, for words of wisdom. Thank you for words of knowledge. Thank you, dear Lord, for being with us this morning. May your presence continue to be with us and dwell amongst us as we go through the rest of thy holy Sabbath. For Christ's sake, amen.